You're listening to The Bridge Project, a student led initiative that seeks to bridge the widening gap between academia and policy making in India by offering a platform for dialogue between scholars and practitioners. Join us on this initiative to help bridge the gap. The United States today is India's largest trade partner with close to 150 billion US dollars in two-way trade between the two democracies. More than 2 decades ago, it was just 11 billion US dollars. Indo-US defense trade, on the other hand, has risen from close to zero in 2008 to 18 billion US dollars today, with an array of strategic agreements signed and greater convergence of strategic interests realized than during any other point in their otherwise contentious history. Further, US investments add up to around 28 billion US dollars in India, along with a slew of American firms that hire India's technical workforce. Even Indian firms have invested around 18 billion US dollars to go with its much celebrated IT outsourcing services. On the cultural front, Indian Americans now make up the largest PIO community anywhere in the world, with estimates showing around 4 million living in the US at present. Additionally, the diaspora community is also one of the wealthiest subgroups by income, which is a testament both to their relative success and the hallowed tenet of the American dream. Exploring these three pillars of politics, business, and diaspora, this episode seeks to understand the changes and continuities in Indo-US relations over the years, especially with the next U.S. presidential elections just around the corner, and what it portends for the relationship between the two countries in the coming years. This makes the India-US relationship certainly one for the ages. In this episode, we are joined by Arun M. Kumar, Chairman and CEO, KPMG India, Sanjeev Joshipura, Executive Director at Diaspora, and Rajesh Mehta, an international consultant and columnist. I'm your host, Carl Jason, co-founder of the Bridge Project, and in this episode, I discuss with our speakers on the impact of the Indian American diaspora and business groups in American society and politics, the significance of the U.S. presidential elections on India and the world, Trump administration's record vis-a-vis strategic and economic cooperation with New Delhi, the areas of cooperation between the two countries in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the future of US-India relations in the coming years. Arun, Sanjeev, and Rajesh, welcome to the Bridge Project.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you so much, Carl.
I'm delighted that we could speak on some of these themes, which in fact have already been making waves for the last few years. But before I can set the ball rolling on discussing some of these themes in the podcast, I wondered if each of you gentlemen could give us a sense of your respective journeys and how that's been like, and what has been your fascination with US-India ties going forward. So if I could start with you, Arun.
Sure. So my journey actually started quite a long time ago when I came to graduate school in the US. But I started my life in India, and my first job was in India, right here in the city of Mumbai, where I now live. Then I lived in California most of my time in the US, and finally served for 3 years in the Obama administration, 2014 to 2017, following which I came back to India to take on my current role as the chairman and CEO of KPMG in India. So it's a journey that started in India, came to the US, and came back to India, and I guess in the famous words of T.S. Eliot, come back to where you started from and you rediscover it for the first time more. So that's been a wonderful experience to be in both places. But the majority of my working life was in the United States. And for me, it was a matter of great pride to represent the United States as the government, the administration of the United States, and in 30 or 40 countries, in various trade missions, in business, in government-to-government dialogues. And one of the areas that I was very involved in was with elevating the US-India commercial relationship. Because I was the Department of Commerce, Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Global Markets, and Director General of the US and Foreign Commercial Service. So at a global remit, in 2014, we made a big focus on India. In 2015, Republic Day, President Obama came to India on his second visit, the first time a US president had visited India twice, and he was a chief guest at the Republic Day parade. And we had a number of new initiatives going on the commerce and economic front between the two countries. But most of my life was in business. In that scenario, I worked a lot with Indian companies, global companies, Silicon Valley companies. So that's been my overall journey, mostly business leadership and a nice, productive stint in the Obama administration, which probably was one of the high points of my professional experiences.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Sanjeev, if I could turn to you.
Absolutely, Carl. Thank you for having me. Thanks to you and your team for having me on this podcast. I'm delighted and honored to be on with Arun and Rajesh because my association with both of them goes back a few years. In Arun's case, not only does he serve on the board of directors at the organization where I work in Diaspora, but also, in addition to that, I've known him in the past when he was the Assistant Secretary of Commerce in the Obama administration, as he just mentioned. As far as Rajesh is concerned, I've had a long innings with him for about, I think, 3 or 4 years as partners in U.S., India, and indeed global Indian diaspora consulting business that he and I founded together before I joined in diaspora. So happy to be here. But I'll just be brief about my own journey. Born and raised in India, and like all good Indian kids, I say this jokingly, of course, of a certain generation, I am a computer engineer. Although I've never worked in computer engineering a single day in my life, I have a fairly eclectic professional background in the sense that I have worked in the private sector in various multinational corporations in India and in the U.S. in different industries, in corporate finance, corporate strategy, and areas like that. But I also have a stream of my background which is related to foreign policy, public policy, U.S.-India relations, politics, those kinds of areas. I'll get to that in a second, but just in terms of my education, did my MBA at the University of Toronto in Canada over 20 years ago, and then had a certification in financial risk management from the Illinois Institute of Technology. I jokingly like to call it the other IIT. But no, in terms of my background on the political side, I have managed a U.S. Senate political election campaign in the state of Illinois, unsuccessfully, I might add, but you learn a lot when you lose. So it was a great experience. I've also been an advisor on Capitol Hill on a couple of committee staffs advising congressmen and senators on international affairs, economics, and budgetary issues, the U.S. budget. I was the president of an international industry association called the Commodity Markets Council that had financial services companies as members from all around the world. And we were an advocacy organization suggesting to the European Commission and the US government what the rules should be governing financial services after the Dodd-Frank bill was passed. I've also been in partnership, like I said, with Rajesh in a global diaspora consulting business, been a visiting lecturer at the State Department on South and Central Asia, training when I say our, I mean American diplomats going to these regions, and have had the privilege of being at in Diaspora for the past 4.5 years almost now. I'm currently the executive director.
Glad to have you with us on this podcast. So I could turn to Rajesh, who played a really pivotal role in getting this together. So Rajesh, over to you.
Hello, everyone. I think to all my friends in US and India who are listening to this wonderful podcast, I would first of all congratulate the Bridge Project, team of youngsters who are doing an amazing work in bridging the gap between researcher and practitioners. It has been a pleasure to hear some of your earlier podcasts with some of the best minds. This student-led initiative is a game changer in a true sense. And I'm also overwhelmed since I'm sharing stage with two of my friends and people I respect a lot, Arun and Sanjeev, who are leaders in the US-India space. They are also doing great job in strengthening both US and India ties. My journey till now has been like a flowing river, which is never still and always transforming. I have held different hats in my journey. My journey started in an American company called Polaroid, where I learned the value of cross cultures, team building, HR, and innovation. Around the beginning of the century, I started my own company in IT services, and later on worked very closely with Sanjeev on the US India space. Uh, I also started helping foreign companies to enter Indian market and take the best advantage of globalization. When the economic crisis hit the global economy, I started working into international consulting. I started helping companies, large or small, even startups on one hand, and various international organizations around innovation, trade, and public affairs in creating their roadmap for India. I'm also the president India of Indo-Scandic organization based out of Sweden. I also write for publications both in the US and India. In US, I write for American Bazaar and Fair Observer, and in India for Financial Express and Daily Guardian on diverse issues from geopolitics to business. I also have successfully written compendiums for companies on issues like women entrepreneurship, skill development, water, which have been well received. Now, the most interesting part is the US-India relations is a very fascinating area since it has all elements which are continuously changing for better. Um, I believe in the world of, I believe in the words of President Obama that US-India relationship is the defining partnership of the 21st century. And the future of the globe depends on how this relationship evolves, whether geopolitically, business related, or people to people. The interesting thing about this relationship is that this relationship is not between Prime Minister Modi or President Trump, but it is much deeper and much stronger than that. The relationship has three major pillars. As eminent scientist Dr. R.A. Mashelkar had once said, technology, trust, and talent. Uh, I, it is based on shared values of democracy, diversity, and we need to work on challenges like COVID-19, climate change, China, and global terrorism. As eminent economist Dr. Jagdish Bhagwati has said, that US-India relationship is a three-body problem, was a three-body problem earlier, because US used to think that India needs US more than US needs India. Now, with the rise of China, both countries need each other equally. I would end by saying that US-India can be the torch bearers of a new world order, which respects democratic principles, human rights, and supports global peace through multilateralism. Over to you. Yeah.
Thanks, Rajesh, and thanks for joining us on the podcast. So I think we can get started on some of the conversations that we've been looking forward to. And I think there's no better way to probably understand the current moment without maybe talking about the US presidential elections. So what I would like to start by asking Rajesh is, why do you think the Indian public or the people back here are quite invested in the elections this time around? So what would be your take on that before I come to the others?
Yeah, so actually it's a very relevant and a timely question. I think when President Donald Trump visited India in February 2020, he was riding very high. The US economy was doing very well, and Congress could not impeach him. And there seemed that Democrats were not united, and it looked that President Trump would win the next elections quite easily. But in last 6 months, everything seems to have gone against him. His handling of the COVID-19 was a disaster. The Black Lives Matter movement started after the killing of George Floyd, and Democrats united on Biden's name. For India, irrespective whether Trump or Biden comes, US-India relationship is on an upward trajectory. Though President Trump and Prime Minister Modi have an excellent personal chemistry, President Trump has undermined India's interest by his ad hoc policies and statements. He's always there to mediate between India and Pakistan or India and China, but not sign an FTA with India. The election also matters because COVID-19 and China crisis is far from over. both US and India need to work strongly um, in the vaccine development and also in containing China. Indian skilled workers in the United States need a president who supports immigration. Joe Biden has promised that he would be giving citizenship to 11 million Indians who do not have proper papers. I believe that Biden's chances of sealing a trade deal or mini trade deal is higher. He was instrumental in the nuclear deal, and I feel with him coming to the office, we might sign the deal quickly. India would be able to continue its friendly relationship with Iran and complete a lot of pending projects, which unfortunately has got stopped because of President Trump's dictating attitude. India and US would be able to closely work in better areas like global health and climate change. I would also want to add that for India, for the globe, Biden might be a better choice as well. For a global perspective, Trump has been like a big failure. US global reputation has hit rock bottom over Trump's corona response. His policy failure has done lasting damage as President has insulted allies and undermined alliances. His actions and views on issues like climate change, gun control, science, race, immigration are so catastrophic that he could be a potential disaster for the world. The world needs from US a leader who has statesmanship qualities and can resolve global conflict. And I think Biden would be a better choice for both India and the world.
Okay. Yeah, that's quite illuminating. If I could maybe ask Arun for his take. So how do you weigh these elections from an Indian standpoint?
So I think actually Rajesh has covered that ground extremely well. I would amplify just a couple of points. One is that actually both countries are heavily vested in each other. At a very high level, I think both countries are vested in each other's democratic values. So even though we might be witnessing a very noisy election, I think you've got to step back and say that there's quite a wonderful thing that every 4 years there is a democratic process that results in a smooth transition of power in the most powerful democracy in the world. Just as in India, one is proud that every 5 years there is a democratic process that results in smooth transition from one government to the next. This cannot be said about many, many countries in the world. And we see that all the time. So I think we should not take that for granted. I think in many ways, both countries are vested in each other, even from values point of view, from a democratic values point of view. Second, the diaspora connection is strong and increasing. Rajesh rightly pointed out the direct impact that immigration policies will have on the diaspora. I think that's a very important aspect.
Right.
Then between the countries, there are security issues that over the last several years, the two countries have come together on security issues, including with other countries like Japan and Australia. So that is probably only going to continue, and that will continue under either a Republican administration or a Democratic administration. Finally, on trade, it is really important that both countries find a way forward. Unfortunately, everybody agrees on both Democrats and Republicans will agree that the two countries have not met their mutual potential in trade and investment.
Right.
There's a long ways to go. The style in which it will be approached will be very different. President Trump has called India a tariff king, and he used very colorful language. He's dramatized many issues like the Harley Davidson motorbikes and so on. I think in a Biden administration there'll be more conversation between the two parties. But I don't want to minimize the fact that there will be differences. Any two large economies will have differences. The question is, how do you work through those and come to win-win solutions?
No, absolutely. I think and we have a lot to unpack there, and we'll probably get to some of those themes later on as we move forward. So Sanjay, if I could just link this with a question that I have for you. So we know of the Indian Americans as a community, or Asian Americans as they are referred to in certain survey data. And they have integrated fairly well into American society. So do you think that is one of the aspects as to why Indians back here are quite motivated to know as to how this is going to play out? The elections in the US are going to play out. So if you could also tell us a little bit about the contributions made by this community to American public life. Over to you.
Thank you, Carl. So yes, I mean, there's no question that the Indian diaspora, the Indian diaspora in America has more than doubled since 2000. Yeah, just in the past 20 years, which is saying something because the story of Indian immigration into America is quite old. In fact, older than most people realize. I think it started in the 1850s and 60s with lots of railroad workers at the time. But of course, it picked up steam after 1965, after the Immigration Acts were signed, which allowed people from countries which were not predominantly Caucasian to migrate to America. But what was a trickle became a flood after 2000. And you're right, Carl, in that the Indian diaspora has played a significant role in the US-India relationship because the breadth of issues in which the diaspora is involved here in America has grown quite exponentially. I'll give you a couple of examples. Only about 8 years ago, in 2012, Indians in America, and I use the word Indians loosely, they might be American citizens now. I mean people of Indian descent or Indian origin is what I'm essentially saying when I say Indians. Indians here would be very accomplished in areas such as technology, entrepreneurship, finance, medicine, academics, all of those kinds of things, which is fantastic and it's something to be heralded. But on the socio-political level, in terms of political power or clout, Indians had almost nothing to say for themselves in America just 8 years ago. Now there has been a sea change on that front. Organizations like Diaspora and many others have played a pivotal role in that. And in the last election cycle in 2018, there were over 100 candidates of Indian origin running at all levels of government, whether it was federal, state, or local. Today, in this election cycle in 2020, there are multiple hundreds of Indian candidates running at different levels. Of course, the most prominent example is Kamala Harris, who is on the vice presidential, on the presidential ticket from the Democratic side. But she's not the only one. There are several others. So the breadth of the Indian diaspora's accomplishments in America has grown tremendously. And this is definitely a factor, I think, a strong factor in keeping the bond and strengthening the bond between our two countries. I'll just say a couple of other things quickly. There is bipartisan support in America for the US-India relationship, which is good to know and has always been the case, quite frankly. But also in addition to that, the China factor now really makes the US-India relationship that much more important, as Rajesh had alluded to in his earlier remarks. This is not to say that the US and India will suddenly see eye to eye on every issue. I mean, Arun talked about that and he's right. But the point is, can you have candid disagreements as friends? Can you work through these issues while not losing sight of the larger perspective as to why the US-India relationship is important in the 21st century? And the last thing I'll say is, just on a global scale, I think one of your questions in the preparatory note, Carl, that you had sent us is why is the US election being paid attention to at a global level in addition to the US-India space? The United States, I think, while it may no longer be the indispensable global power, as you look at developments, for example, in the European Union, you look at developments in Asia as well. I mean, the US is not involved in every discussion like they used to be involved before for a variety of different reasons. Some of which are by choice, others are, out of, I think, errors in execution of strategic judgment that America has made. But nonetheless, the United States is still very much the major global power and likely to remain so for at least the near-term future. And so what happens in America clearly matters. I mean, there is no question about that, whether it's Asia, whether it's Europe, whether it's Latin America, whatever it might be. So the US elections remain a vitally important event to be watched, all across the globe.
I think you've just made some really important points, and I would like to, in fact, turn to Arun and maybe just pick on something which Sanjeev had pointed out with regard to the political clout of the Indian American community. And in fact, I remember reading this during my research work for this podcast, that there was a particular instance after or during the Kargil War when you had a failure on the part of, say, the Congress to, in fact, pass a resolution to criticize Pakistan. And what we see later is that the Indian American community actually mobilized and, in fact, bombarded, their senators and representatives with phone calls and fax messages demanding that the US should call for cutting off international loan and aid to Pakistan, which I think was an unprecedented sort of a development. But one of the other issues, which I feel is really where the Indian American community was able to exhibit its clout in a way, and that is to do with the negotiations during the Indo-Civil U.S. nuclear deal, of which you will probably be able to share a few anecdotes with us. So do you think this, the Indo-U.S. civil nuclear deal, was the watershed moment as far as the Indian American community's political rise in terms of American elections?
I think the Indo-US nuclear deal was a very important moment. It was very important for both countries because it suddenly took India into a different sphere of a relationship. There had been some kind of nuclear apartheid that India was subject to, not just by the United States, but a number of countries in the nuclear club. And it was important for India to put the whole Pokhran infamy, if you might, behind and move towards an appropriate role as a responsible nuclear power. So that was an extremely important thing. I feel it was in the interest of the United States and of India to do that. Certainly it was in the interest of the United States to have a strategic partner in India and to have a friendly partner in India. So I think the more important issue was that it brought a lot of Indian Americans into the political process. They got engaged in an issue that happened to have quite a lot to do with India. I don't know to what extent that would have tilted the policy making or the decision, the outcomes. I think the outcomes were very clearly outcomes of mutual interest, equally of the United States, and I don't think it was necessarily that without the Indian lobbying, if you might, it would not have happened. It could well have happened even without that. Because the US, like most countries, very clear-eyed about what's good for the country. But what it did was it brought the Indian Americans into the political process in a way that they had not been involved probably since the time of Dalip Singh Sound. Many years, in the 50s was the first congressman from India. So that mobilization came about. I thought that was interesting. When it comes to issues like wars, issues with neighbors, etc., the question becomes more complicated because you've got to realize that those countries also have their, people of their origin in the U.S.
Yeah, I think that's quite fascinating as well. And if I could maybe come to a contemporary kind of development, which is to do with the Trump administration's engagement with both with New Delhi and also vice versa. So, Rajesh, if I could ask you on your kind of opinion on what has been the one policy success and failure of the Trump administration vis-a-vis its engagement with India.
It is indeed a tricky question, but I would try to answer it. I think the biggest failure of Trump administration engagement with India was not to seal even a mini trade deal. When Prime Minister Modi and President Trump have a superb personal chemistry. The uncertain future of the stalled negotiations creates a lot of uncertainties and bottlenecks for US companies in India and vice versa. If some kind of trade deal would have been concluded successfully, we might have been able to address issues like immigration, GSP, and come out of the ad hocism which is prevalent now. The biggest success of Trump administration is its vocal support to India against China and Pakistan. On the defense and security side, the relationship has not been better. As we are discussing co-production and co-development of defense equipment. The revival of Quad and Quad Plus between countries like U.S., India, Japan, and Australia is a success of Trump administration. As you know, Quad was formed in 2004 as a group for human assistance, but was withdrawn in 2008. But Quad was revitalized in 2017. In March 2020, three more countries like South Korea, New Zealand, and Vietnam exchanged notes to tackle COVID-19 and economic recovery post-pandemic. There's a prospect that UK might also join the alliance in the future. As the president of USISPF, Dr. Mukesh Aghi continuously says that Quad has the potential of becoming an economic bloc which would facilitate investments, innovation, infrastructure development, and mobility of professionals. So Quad and Quad Plus is an alliance to counterweight Chinese might and power. I hope I've been able to answer your question.
Yeah, sure. No, I think that was quite relevant. And Sanjeev, would you agree with this characterization that the Indo-US ties had actually furthered, at least on the strategic level, but has not really picked up on the trade front, which I think all of you had alluded to in your opening remarks. So what would be your assessment of the Trump administration's engagement with India?
So a couple of things. I agree with what Rajesh just said. In terms of successes of the Trump administration in regards to US-India policy, I think there's a couple of things. The relationship or the optics of the relationship between President Trump and Prime Minister Modi has catapulted the US-India relationship into sort of a top-tier relationship, at least in terms of optics. Yeah. Now, and I think that's a good thing for both countries. Now, having said that, there is a difference between the optics and what actually is transpiring in terms of practical agreements. Rajesh talked about the removal of GSP. Arun has talked about it as well. I think that has been a disappointment on both sides. The immigration issue, whether it comes to green cards, the H-1B visas, all of those things, they are, I think, fairly large stumbling blocks that need to be overcome, because that is something that the Indian government, as well as India-oriented lobby groups in the United States, keep talking about all the time with the highest levels of the US government. So I would say those are significant failures. In terms, the other point I want to make is that I think there is a bifurcation of the US-India relationship into two significant areas. One is, I would say, the economic side, and the other is the defense or the geopolitical side. And observers who are, far more expert than me in this subject have noted that on the economic and trade side, there leaves room for improvement. There is a lot to be desired in terms of what the US and India can achieve together. This is not to say that the US and India have not, grown closer in the economic and trading space over the past 5, 10, 15 years. They absolutely have. There's no question of it. And the numbers are evidence of it, whether it's foreign direct investment, whether it's, trade in capital goods, services, all of those things. Students in universities from India in America, although not so much the other way around just yet. The numbers are there to support that. But there's a lot of room for improvement on the economic side. However, on the defense and geopolitical side, as Rajesh talked about, and I think Arun briefly mentioned in his opening remarks as well, the Quad Plus alliance, while not a formal alliance just yet, has the makings of something very significant among countries that are sort of like-minded in terms of democratic values and so forth. And while not explicitly saying it, could end up serving for various national interests that these countries have as a geopolitical bulwark against China, Although the tricky thing there, of course, is that you want to make sure you maintain trading links while also serving as a geopolitical barrier against what is now the second largest economy in the world.
Right. Well, I think that's quite interesting, and also I think I remember reading one of Rajesh's article, and it spoke about how United States and India can cooperate on some of the business and economic fronts. And we live in an era where globalization is facing strains, and we are more likely to see a stronger, say, country-to-country bilateral engagement, and this opens up an opportunity for countries like India and the U.S. So I'd like to ask you to maybe briefly tell us about how can both these countries cooperate under the Atmanirbhar program, which is being touted as a game changer by the government here.
Okay. Prime Minister Modi at the recent USIBC summit gave a clarion call for the participation of US in the Atmanirbhar program. In his address, Prime Minister Modi emphasized that for India to become self-reliant, it needs help of US. Atmanirbhar program came into light because of COVID and China crisis. Prime Minister Modi saw huge imports from China, even on active pharmaceutical ingredients. The necessity to develop pharma and healthcare was just the starting point. From the time of COVID, India has started to increase its domestic capability. India has become, I think, the largest PPE producer now. Now, India needs support of US investment in energy, infrastructure, agriculture, defense. Though Atmanirbhar program, through Atmanirbhar program, Prime Minister Modi wants to lay a red carpet to US companies to manufacture in India, not only for India, but for the world. Now, since US companies are diversifying business from China, they can think of India as a potential country to enter at this stage. The Quad Alliance can also strengthen the Atmanirbhar program because it might get companies from US, Japan, and Australia to move supply chains to India. Like Apple has started manufacturing iPhones in India. Similarly, other US companies can diversify and take benefit of the Atmanirbhar program. US companies would have to send low risk or high reward products to try in India first, while keeping its base in China initially. And later on, they can move completely to India if they wish to. Defense is a sector where US can take maximum benefit of the Atmanirbhar program. India has increased FDI in defense from 49% to 74% to the automatic tools. So there's a huge opportunity here. Thus, I would end by saying that there can be a huge cooperation because of the Atmanirbhar program. But the verdict is still to come. Let's see what happens next.
Yes, let's see what happens on that front. It is too early to say, as you rightly pointed out. So Arun, if I could maybe just pick on that thread and just ask you a two-part question in a sense, which is what have been some of the institutional and structural challenges to furthering trade and economic ties? So we know on the one hand, the Indian policy environment is quite over-regulated, and that's been a reason for concern for a lot of the companies investing here. And at the same time, you also have institutions like the United States Trade Representative who has been playing hardball, especially under the Trump administration. Trump himself being quite vocal on the issues of trade deficit that the United States has with certain countries, including India. So is this a component of the deterioration in the trade ties? Not to be too critical, but at the same time, do you think there is scope for improvement there?
I think there's a lot of scope for improvement, for sure. As I said in my earlier comments, the potential here for the relationship is immense. And yes, there are some structural challenges. You mentioned the USTR, there are negotiating agencies, etc. You could step back a little bit and say that at the end of the day, all of this is about domestic politics. It's like if you want to take care of agriculture and dairy farmers, you have to make sure that their issues are brought to the table. If India wants to protect certain cultural practices, those issues have to be on the table. So at the end of the day, all of this is about domestic constituencies that democratic governments have to protect. And then there are two aspects. One is the short-term issues, and when there's an election coming up. There are longer-term issues. When you talk about a free trade agreement, etc., you're saying, okay, we all understand that long term this is better for the competitiveness of both the parties involved. Overall, economics teaches us we'll all do better with a free trade agreement. In the short term, there are some winners and losers, and the politics is how do you manage those? What kinds of policy instruments, incentives, etc., do you deploy? What kind of communications do you have? So that's what, and this applies in any democracy, and in India and the US, we see similar challenges in these spaces.
Yeah, I think maybe the second part I can direct it to Sanjeev here. So Sanjeev, there are organizations that promote India-US business ties, as Arun had kind of brought up. So you have the USISPF, the USIBC, and these organizations have repeatedly highlighted the need for regulatory cohesion as far as India's policy making space is concerned. So, given your kind of expertise in some of these areas, what would be a few recommendations that you would like to propose, being an Indian American and being aware about some of these developments that happen?
In addition to the ones you mentioned, Carl, USIBC and USISPF, which are essentially housed on the US side but work extensively in India. There are also, as you know, organizations that are housed on the Indian side that work extensively in America, such as FICCI, CII, and others, that do great work in this space in terms of building bridges between America and India as far as industry goes. And there are others as well. I mean, NASSCOM does a lot of work as well. I think it's very hard on a sector by sector level because in each sector you read the briefing notes sometimes from each of these organizations. And on a sector by sector basis, there is a litany of issues that needs to be addressed. I think without getting into the sectoral things, because I don't think this podcast necessarily has even enough time for all of those in detail. I think one area that I would strongly recommend that the US and India focus on in a general way across sectors is subnational cooperation in industry. Just like India, the United States is also a federalist system of government. There are several issues that are dealt with at the state level, and without necessarily the central government in India, or as in America we call it here, the federal government being involved. And I think when states collaborate directly with each other on issues of infrastructure, energy, renewables, and so on and so forth, manufacturing, electric vehicles, all of those kinds of things. There are numerous collaborations that are already in the works between various states on both sides. In fact, there is a think tank here in Washington, D.C. Called CSIS, which has an India operation, the Wadhwani Center for India Studies, which is very active in promoting subnational collaboration. That's an area that doesn't get enough attention, but where I think you can move the needle very significantly.
Right. We
So
just
one
quick
more
follow
area
up.
to that, Sanjeev.
Yeah, sure.
There are actually, as Sanjeev points out, many areas that should get more attention. Like one of them is standards and regulatory coordination. The United States has one set of standards for products and services. India has another set. Actually, both sides have multiple sets. How do you synchronize, harmonize them? It would make it much easier to conduct business across the two economies if that could be done. Similarly, regulatory simplification. There are multiple regulators working. How do you simplify them? How do you have them talk to each other and come to a set of regulations that can be easily dealt with by companies on both sides? So there are many, many areas of that kind that are not really contentious. They just need to be focused on.
Okay. So I had a follow-up to this, and which is to do with the Indian businesses that operate in the US. And I think according to one report, it's roughly, I might be wrong on the exact number, but the figure is roughly 22 billion US dollars. And an increase in their contribution also to overall employment generation, philanthropic and CSR programs. So are there particular areas that you would like to highlight as far as the US policy establishment can maybe address some of these issues? So anything specific to the US policy climate?
See, all the Indian business leaders I've spoken to, they say that the US is the easiest place to do business.
Right.
So rarely do we get suggestions that they're having difficulty, etc. The issues would be like immigration is definitely an issue. If it could be easier to deal with immigration, that would really help further more investment from India, definitely. So there are a few issues like that. But by and large, Indian investors see the
Have not
US
really
as
complained.
an easy place to do business.
Got it.
I agree with what Arun said. The only thing I'll add here, Carl, is that when you look at whether it's Indian companies in America or whether it's global companies that happen to be run by people of Indian origin that are based in America, you look at their contributions in the realm of stakeholder capitalism, yeah, which is now much in vogue as opposed to just shareholder capitalism. You find that a lot of these leaders, a lot of these Indian companies, and a lot of these Indian business CEOs are doing really tremendous work here in America and around the world in the philanthropic and corporate social responsibility area, whether it is in the movement for social justice, whether it is protecting the environment, whether it is COVID relief. In all of these areas, I think there are companies that are doing a fantastic job. I don't want to, tout in Diaspora too much, but I'll just give you a quick example. Recently, Diaspora released a list of the top Indian origin CEOs at global companies around the world, Forbes 2000 and Fortune 500 companies. And there were 60 Indians on that list, or Indian origin folks on that list. And, in a press conference where we interviewed several of them, the commitment to a lot of these issues that I just spoke about, the stakeholder capitalism kind of issues, the corporate social responsibility kinds of issues, was really palpable and really admirable. And, the focus of the conversation was really not so much about look at our companies and look at how these, Indian leaders are achieving tremendous things in the business realm. I mean, that is obvious. That's evident. If you're a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, you are doing well in the business realm. But the conversation was really around how can we move the needle? How can we contribute to making, I don't want to sound too Pollyannish, but making the world a better place.
Right. And, we'll in fact link the report in our show notes of this episode. Rajesh, if I could maybe quickly come back to you, and this is following up on your previous response, where you in fact had touched upon the supply chains. Now, again, there was a lot of talk about how the supply chains are due to shift from China to India and even to countries like Vietnam. Now, while the latter seems to have made significant headway still, we don't really see this in the case of India. And why do you think this is the case as far as bottlenecks are concerned?
Very important question is at this juncture. Now, I would start with what Napoleon had said about China. He had said that let China sleep, for when she wakes, she will shape the world. I say that my response to this question is mixed. Now, more than 1,000 US companies are thinking of India as a destination to shift supply chains. But COVID, economic turbulence in the globe, and Indian economy and other bottlenecks have delayed their decision. Some companies might not shift to India because they would prefer supply chains to be closer. Now, the relationship of US with China and India is changing very fast. According to Pew Center survey, 2/3 of Americans have an unfavorable view about China. And you would be amazed to see that respondents found India the most attractive destination. Prime Minister Modi's marketing of brand Bharat has succeeded to some extent. Recently, Facebook invested $5.7 billion in Geo at the time when both India and US were in lockdown due to COVID. So India is a favorite destination for US companies because it has young, smart, English-speaking workforce, strong diaspora, cost of labor is cheap, and access to Indian market is huge. India, though has improved its ease of doing business ranking and innovation ranking, it needs to do more to get US companies to India. India has to be more competitive than countries like Vietnam or Indonesia or Philippines. India needs to remove regulatory cholesterol like trade barriers, import restrictions, logistical inefficiencies, high tariffs, increased custom duties if we want to attract more FDI. India needs to overcome both infrastructure and government challenges. If India can be more competitive with stable and welcoming government policy, I'm sure more FDI would come to India and supply chains would shift to India. Maybe Arun is the best person to answer this question.
Rajesh, you've put it all right, and we should also not forget that in the coming years, India's market is going to be a very, very attractive market. As incomes rise in India, as it inevitably will.
Right.
So there are many, many reasons why every global company ought to be in India or to be considering India. They're not already here. Most of them are here, in one way or the other.
Right. So we'll come to the final sort of segment here, and we'll, in fact, take a few questions that we've received from social media for this particular episode. And if I could come to you, Arun, first, we have a question from Vipul Jani, who's the editor of the Canada India Insight publication. And his question is, how important will the China factor be in India-U.S. cooperation? I think that is a given as we move forward from here on. Especially if the Democrats win. So do you see anything different in terms of India's approach, India-US approach, if the Democrats were to be in power? And what will be the spillover effects be of this?
No, I think the reality is that today both Democrats and Republicans are fairly close on their view of China. So that's the situation. I don't think, therefore, that which administration is in power in the US is going to affect US-India relations as it relates to China. I don't think. I think they're both going to be on the same page. What has happened, as I was actually mentioned earlier by one of my fellow panelists, was that there's been an increase in security cooperation between India and the US. There's been more defense sales, defense production, co-production, etc. All that's been happening. And I don't see any reason why that will slow down, because all that was happening in the Obama administration as well. The DTTI, the Defense Trade and Technology Cooperation Initiative, was put in place. So all that has a long history and a lot of momentum, and will continue.
Sure. So this is a question.
The area to think about for both countries that could be different is where multilateral issues are concerned. For example, what is the US position to WHO and to multilateral agencies? What is the US position to climate change? Climate change is extremely important for India. And as it turns out, as we see in California, from the California fires, for the US as well. Big difference in the attitude of a Biden administration and a Trump administration. And there clearly India has been a big supporter of coordinated action on climate change. And there will be greater alignment with the Democratic administration. Similarly on WHO, multilateral organizations, there will be greater alignment for India with the Democratic administration.
Right. I think that's a very, very interesting point. And like climate change, I think one of the other areas where we are likely to see, the so-called great power competition is probably in AI. And our next question, which Sanjeev can probably take up, is from Manish Mehta. And his question is, where do you see the India-US partnership in the next 10 years in the areas of science technology, especially in the field of AI?
In terms of cooperation in science and technology between the two countries, there is an active program already ongoing. In terms of, there are several active programs, but there has been an active program that has been going on for several years now between the US and India, where there is a senior official here at the Indian Embassy in Washington, D.C., for example, who is tasked with increasing US and India scientific collaboration and research. That is that person's entire job. And people don't often realize this because it's not something that occupies the headlines, because, by definition, scientific research and so forth are things that have long gestation times before they fructify. But they are vitally important because they, result in the breakthroughs of tomorrow. So there's a lot of this work already going on. I think clearly more needs to be done. And more can be done. I think US universities are waking up to the potential of not just the Indian market. I think that they've been aware of for a while, but in terms of Indian academic talent and the potential not just to have India be a source of students for the US universities, but also as university academic collaborators and research partners in various fields, whether it's healthcare, whether it's the software development field, lots of different areas like this. And that I only see increasing over time, not just in the next 10-year horizon, but even in the near-term future, regardless of, I think, who wins the next election. I see those things as continuing. So, on the issue of, I know you asked specifically on AI, on that, I think I'll pass on that question if you don't mind, just because that is not something that I have deep expertise in that particular field.
Sure. In fact, maybe I can club this into the final question that I have for Rajesh here. And the question really is on an area which is also, like Sanjeev had pointed out, is bound to find areas of commonalities between both countries, and that is in innovation, more largely in startups, and also in the sector of education. So, what would be your what would be your take on this?
Now, the US has already played a great role in innovation and education in the country. And I think this relationship will only become stronger as we move ahead. In 1960s, US played an important role in supporting the Green Revolution, which was fostered and funded by the Ford Foundation. It helped in feeding increasing Indian population and combating famine in India. Now, bilateral initiatives in field of innovations like the U.S. Technology Forum, India Science Technology Endowment Fund, and DTTI are examples of this. There can be a huge alliance between U.S. and India on digital, AI, 5G, cyberspace. In space technologies, the private companies like Boeing and Raytheon have already started working with the DRDO. Both India and US are now members of the Global Partnership of Artificial Intelligence, which has been formed to counter China. India is the third largest startup hub and needs support of US investors and Indian diaspora to leapfrog into newer technologies. India innovation partnership with the US can be trilateral. And I think Sanjeev is playing an important role there because I think they, in diaspora, organize a lot of events between India, US, and Israel on the startup side. So similarly, a lot of trilaterals can be between India, US, Japan, India, US, Australia, and India, US, UK. And I would also want to add that the next decade is the golden decade for US-India collaboration for entrepreneurship and innovation, because it is the first time that there are product companies emerging from India. So earlier it was only service companies. Now it's the product companies coming in cloud, big data, AI, mobility, which needs partnerships with investors in the Silicon Valley.
And there are several, sorry, go ahead, Rajesh.
Yeah. Please, Sanjeev. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, to add to your point, Rajesh, there are several other countries that have also expressed interest in this kind of tripartite collaboration. I mean, Ireland has expressed interest, forming sort of technology centers between Dublin, Hyderabad, Bangalore, and Silicon Valley. Ireland, of course, had until very recently and is likely to have again in the very near future, based on their power sharing arrangement, a prime minister of Indian origin in Varadkar. So a lot of countries have expressed this kind of interest in the numerous conversations that we have around the world. In fact, Arun was part of that visit to Israel about 3 years ago. The only other thing I'll say is on the private sector. I think just this morning, it has been reported, and speaking of collaboration at the subnational level, the Karnataka government is in talks with Elon Musk and Tesla to set up Tesla's biggest R&D center outside America in Bangalore. So, that's an encouraging piece of news if it fructifies.
True.
Yeah, and in fact, even probably a very encouraging note to end on, because I'm sure we can take on a lot more questions, but unfortunately the podcast needs to come to an end. Gentlemen, I've thoroughly enjoyed every minute of this. Thank you so much for taking the time out. It was my pleasure.
Thank you, Carl.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Carl.
Thanks.
We hope you enjoyed this episode.
If you wish to read more about the themes discussed in this episode, head on over to the show notes for the links. You can follow Arun on Twitter at ArunMKU, Sanjeev at Sanjeev Joshipur, and Rajesh at Entry India. We would really appreciate it if you could share this episode on your social media pages. We would also love to hear your feedback, so do feel free to reach out to us at thebridgeproject2020@gmail.com. Stay tuned for the next episode that will hit your podcast app soon. Thanks for listening, and until next time, it's the Bridge Project signing off.